Hello, Year 12. This is Miss Wills again, and we're going to be continuing to look at Radio 1 today. And for lesson 9, we'll be looking at how to write a response, how to structure a response, and what kind of to include in responses as well. Okay, so we're going to start with where we kind of finished off last lesson, and that was introducing this question. Now, as I say, this question is worth 15 marks, therefore you'd be expected to spend about 20 to 25 minutes on it. The question was, explain why popular music radio programs struggle to gain recognition as public service broadcasting. And it asks you to refer to BBC Radio 1 Breakfast Show to support your answer. Also, of course, you need to make sure you're talking about political, cultural and economic contexts, of course, which affect the radio programming. So there's all these kind of things that we need to discuss within our answer. But I think the question itself lends itself quite nicely to actually discuss the debates around kind of those contexts as well and the ideas around those contexts. So then what I asked you to do, guys, was I asked you to think about what information is going to be useful and relevant for the question that's being asked. What I have done is separate into two boxes. The fact that you need to really talk about and discuss and use information that kind of relates to the struggle in gaining recognition as public service broadcaster, but also the fact that you need to consider cultural, political and economic factors as well. But you will probably see that a lot of the points you make kind of come under both subheadings. So that's totally fine. But what hopefully you did yesterday was get your key kind of facts, your key ideas, key points down in those boxes that we can use today to help you answer a question. So you're going to have a go at writing one of your points, developing one of your ideas and points into a paragraph for me. So you won't be writing a full response today, but just practicing a paragraph. So just to show you some examples of what you might have had in those boxes. So we obviously need to think about, first of all, the needs, the fact that BBC Radio 1 have this obligation. They need to make sure that they are producing high quality, high standard radio, and obviously using the Writhian values of inform, entertain and educate to make sure that they are justifying really the fact that we are paying our fees for this, for the radio. So with that, of course, we need to make sure, as I've got on here, it must be high quality to justify the fees. And if you look in the cultural and political and economic factor box, I've kind of talked about the idea that, you know, at the bottom there, other radio stations suggest it's stunting the growth of radio. So actually there's a debate around the fact, well, should the BBC, should BBC Radio 1 actually be funded? Is it providing everything we actually need? And there is that suggestion that it is stunting the growth of radio for other companies who it's competing with as well. But on top of that, you've got the issue of it. We've got a lot of people calling for it to be privatised now as well. And, you know, the low cultural status of youth culture and pop music, which essentially BBC Radio 1 Breakfast Show is all about. And the fact that their specific audience, the 15 to 29-year-old target audience, or, as I've got in the box, are young digitally native listeners who are less likely to listen to radio. So why, therefore, are we paying this license fee? There is the debate for a target audience who possibly might not even be using it. And, you know, you can use the statistics you looked at, the drops in figures for what kind of the youth of today is more likely to use rather than listen to radio. So there are all those kind of issues. But at the same time, you need to think about, yes, Radio 1, BBC Radio 1 are facing these issues and have these kind of struggles. However, what are they actually doing to identify and showing us they're doing by identifying it and combating these challenges as well in any sort of way? So, for example, offering a range of modes, audience interaction, being accessible on a range of platforms for people, using things like social media as well to make sure they're really targeting their audience to get that listenership up as well. And of course, making sure they do stick to the values of inform, entertain, and educate, and the Ofcom requirements as well is a really big part of it. So these are all different kind of things that we can discuss and ideas that are relevant to the question. What you need to make sure when you're given a question on Radio 1 is that whatever it asks you, you do not just throw any information, every bit of information you know about BBC Radio 1 Breakfast Show at the question and that's your response. You need to make sure you're answering the question. Therefore, the information that you use, that you pick out, that you know you need, has to be relevant to it. You need to kind of practice selecting the relevant bits of information and using that to form a kind of point, develop a point or a line of argument. So that's what we need to be kind of looking at, and that's what we're going to practice over the next couple of lessons. So what I'd like you to do now is, well, we're going to be looking at exactly how we're going to be setting out a response for BBC Radio 1 Breakfast Show. So on the next slide, and I'll just get this on now, it's kind of showing you this is the kind of thing you need to think about. So when you're writing your response, remember you don't have forever. It's only 15 marks. So you do need to spend, let's say, about 20 to 25 minutes. You will need an introduction, and I'm going to kind of go through what an introduction looks like in a moment. And you will also need about 3 to 4 developed points answering the question. So I've just started on the right-hand side here, thinking about, well, what possible points could I have that I could then go on to develop that do directly answer this question. So the first one I've kind of talked about, we've got the issue and the struggle of holding on to a young digitally native listeners who are increasingly moving online and preferring their own music playlists to radio output. There's a point. It's a really valid point, and then obviously I could develop that by using statistics. But also, I will probably mention how BBC Radio 1 have had to identify this and have had to make sure that they do appeal to an audience. How are they doing that? Well, let's think. They are actually using social media as well. So coming away from just the radio side itself to promote the radio. They're including live music, of course, which is different to, they won't get that from their streaming, from playlists in their own playlist. But they get that from the breakfast show with the Radio 1. So that's something they offer that is going to help with that, kind of increase listenership. But also thinking about the kind of things they do online, like they do on radio, such as getting their listeners to select what songs are going to come on next, etc. So there's all sorts you could kind of say there. Low cultural status of youth culture and popular music, which makes it harder for Breakfast Show to prove it's meeting its public service obligations. The fact that BBC's obligations to promote and fund digital technologies, so they need to make sure they are doing this, but in doing this, how does it help kind of promote them as well? Convergence opportunities that come from being part of the BBC as well, definitely. We've talked about that in the past, but also about the kind of perhaps celebrities and, famous people who are easily recognised that can be perhaps used across kind of the BBC stations, etc. So it's kind of, these are all really, really important points that could be made and that you could develop. So I'm going to go now onto the next slide to kind of show you exactly how we start response. So thinking about the introduction. So when we're thinking about introductions for this type of question, what we really need to think about is, well, first of all, we need to outline the issue. We need to answer the question. So what is the question actually asking? What is the key issue? What is my focus here? And then you need to show the examiner you understand what the question is asking and the key issues around that question. So for example, here is me with the eye here. identifying the issue. So the central issue facing the Radio 1 as youth-focused public service broadcaster is the tension between the need to fulfil its Rethian obligations to inform, educate, entertain, and provide distinctive content, and the need to compete with commercial broadcasters for the attention of young listeners who are listening to less and less radio. So what that kind of introduction does there is it outlines, it's a summary of the key kind of issues that they face. Not only do they need to make sure they inform, educate, and entertain, but they also need to make sure the content that they're providing is content that will make sure they maintain the attention of young listeners, that they don't lose them to other radio stations as well. And also the fact that less of them are listen to radio, which is shown and proven by statistics. You also need to, if there's a debate about whatever question's being asked, introduce the debate, okay? What is the key kind of, just as really introduction, you're talking about context a lot, aren't you? You're thinking about the bit wider kind of debate, the bigger picture about radio and about BBC Radio 1 their role as a public service broadcaster. So here with the debate, the need to promote live music, champion new music and offer news content can run the risk of alienating young listeners. So there's the issue of really needing to make sure they target their audience, but at the same time they have to make sure they're doing all these things and that they're fulfilling the Rethian obligations, of course. So they need to get a good balance between the two, don't they? On the other hand, being part of BBC brings with it a range of commercial advantages, not least of which is the freedom to be more experimental in their output. So there we have in an introduction the key issues identified and what the key debate really is. We're looking at really two sides to this. Yes, they have the issue where they need to make sure that they're targeting audience and that they are fulfilling the Rethian obligations, but they also, on the positive side of things, they have a bit more freedom and can be more experimental with the type of music that they are putting out there. So that's really, really important. So that's a good introduction that kind of does straight away talk about those key issues. What I've put next is really you want to link straight away your introduction to your first point. Okay, so this would be a potential first point for a response. Perhaps the biggest challenge facing the breakfast show is how to hold on to young digitally native listeners who are increasingly moving online, preferring their own playlists to radio output. There is my first point after my introduction. And then, of course, that needs developing. Okay, so that brings me on to the next slide and a task I would like you to complete today for me, guys. So here are a number of points you could really run with for this question. All I would like you to do is to choose one of these points and develop it into a paragraph for me. Now, what I want to see in these paragraphs, in terms of when you're developing your point, you need specific examples, specific statistics if it requires you to do so. For example, if you're talking about the fact that the biggest challenge is that they need to hold on to young digitally native listeners, look and use those statistics that kind of show that the listenership is dropping in young people and why that's the case. Draw in cultural and political, economic context as well. And where you can, for example, this is an issue, discuss how the radio station is actually, and how the show itself is actually trying to combat, is identifying these issues and is doing something about that, and have had to kind of evolve to make sure that they are still relevant. What do they do on the show? Use specific examples, for example, from your own audit and from the analysis that you have been doing. How are they making sure that they are, for example, fulfilling their obligations to inform, entertain and educate? So I say, I want 1 point and I want you to redevelop that in a paragraph to just have a go at answering that question. And then if you can please upload that to your blog. Thank you very much for listening, guys.